Welcome to our presentation on the history, evolution, and impact of the California Adult Education Program. The California Adult Education Program, referred to as CAEP, consortia, were formed as part of a statewide initiative to improve and expand adult education services in California. The goal of CAEP consortia is to create a more integrated, efficient, and equitable system to implement adult education. Before CAEP, California's educational system was fragmented, with different schools, community college, and community-based organizations offering separate programs that didn't always work together. There was no centralized effort to align resources, share best practices, or ensure that programs were meeting the needs of local communities. Consortia were created to bring these different agencies together into regional groups that could work collaboratively, share resources, and create coordinated plans to better meet local educational needs. California's adult education programs were historically underfunded. Funding for adult education was spread across multiple sources, often making it difficult for providers to plan and deliver sustainable programs. By forming CAEP consortia, California aimed to consolidate funding into a more unified system, creating a steady, reliable stream of resources to support adult education across the state. Before CAEP, adult education in California was seen as a patchwork of services that varied greatly from region to region. Some areas had more robust programs, while others had very limited offerings. CAEP consortia helped create a more structured, cohesive framework for delivering adult education, ensuring that all areas had access to necessary programs. Meeting the demands of a changing workforce has been a growing responsibility of adult education. There has been a recognition that adult ed needs to be more closely tied to the needs of the labor market. CAEP consortia were tasked with working closely with local employers to design programs that would help adults acquire the specific skills required for new and emerging jobs. This alignment with workforce development goals was intended to help close the skills gap and ensure that adult learners had opportunities for career advancement. CAEP consortia were created with an emphasis on equity, ensuring that adult education programs were designed to serve traditionally marginalized communities. The goal is to provide access to support, resources, and opportunities for adult learners throughout the state. Regional planning allowed each consortium to assess the unique needs of their community, ensuring that education services were targeted where they were most needed. The fragmented system of adult education meant that there wasn't always a clear way to measure student progress or assess the success of different programs. Consortia were tasked with setting common goals and tracking student outcomes. The idea was that by working together and sharing data, local providers could improve the quality of services, develop best practices, and ensure that students were progressing toward meaningful outcomes. With so many different entities offering adult education programs across the state, there was often a duplication of efforts and wasted resources. CAEP consortia have allowed for more efficient use of resources by encouraging local agencies to share facilities, combine services, and coordinate efforts, which ultimately made adult education more effective and cost-efficient. CAEP consortia were also formed to ensure that adult education programs could serve students at every stage of their educational journey, from those working on basic literacy skills to those preparing for higher education or advanced vocational training. The goal was to create clear educational pathways, including stackable credentials and certifications that would allow adult student learners to progressively build skills and advance in their careers. The formation of CAEP consortia is a result of the Adult Education Block Grant, called AEBG. This was legislation passed in 2013 in Senate Bill for California No. 173. This bill allocated funding to local educational agencies to support adult education programs. The consortia were set up to help improve and expand adult education in the state. The consortia are groups of local schools, community colleges, and other organizations that work together to offer adult education programs. When California passed the Adult Education Block Grant, AEBG, to better support adult learners, it gave more money to local schools and colleges to improve programs like ESL, English as a Second Language, basic skills, high school diploma completion and equivalency, job training, and more. The law required schools and colleges to team up in consortia or groups to plan and run adult education programs in their areas so they could share resources and make services more effective. The consortia were set up within regional boundaries. The state of California divided into regions, and each consortium had to form based on those regions. There are 71 adult education consortia covering all 58 counties in the state. Each consortium had to figure out what kinds of adult education services were needed in their area. They would then come up with a plan for how to use the money and resources to meet those needs. Schools, community colleges, and other groups, like nonprofits and community-based organizations and county offices of education, in each area had to work together. The goal was to make sure adult education programs were coordinated and met local needs. Local schools, community colleges, and other groups came together to form each consortium. They worked out how they would share responsibilities, how to spend the funding, and what programs to offer. Each consortium created a regional plan to show what services they would offer and how they would make things work. This plan had to be approved by the state. The state then gave money to the consortia to fund adult education programs, such as classes, training, and student support. The consortia have to report back to the state on how well they're doing, how the money is being spent, and what kinds of results they're seeing for their adult learners. Adult education in California began informally in the late 1800s with night schools and literacy programs, primarily to help immigrants learn English and gain basic skills. In the early to mid-1900s, adult education expanded with vocational training, high school completion programs, and ESL classes. It became more formalized with support from public schools, community colleges, and community organizations. By the late 20th century, the system faced funding cuts and fragmentation, making it harder for adults to access consistent, high-quality education. Before 2013, adult education programs in California were funded by a patchwork of different sources, including federal, state, and local funds. Adult schools, community colleges, and community-based organizations offered a wide range of programs. However, these programs were often fragmented and not well coordinated. Many adult education programs were underfunded and lacked consistency across districts, which made it harder for the adults to access the services they needed. By the early 2000s, California saw an increasing demand for adult education due to the state's growing population and the changing workforce. There was a growing recognition that adult learners needed more opportunities to improve basic skills, gain vocational training, and prepare for higher education. Despite this demand, the state faced budget crises during the recession, and it led to cuts in funding for many educational programs, including adult education. In 2013, California passed major reform to address these issues. SB 173 established the Adult Education Block Grant Program, and this was a significant shift in how adult education was funded and delivered in the state. AEBG consolidated several funding streams into one block grant, making it easier for local education agencies like school districts and community colleges to coordinate and plan adult education programs across regions. The goal of the AEBG was to improve adult education by encouraging collaboration among different types of educational providers, while also increasing funding to meet the rising demand for adult education services. The AEBG allocated $500 million in funding for adult education in its first year, 2015 to 2016, with future funding to be distributed annually. In 2015, the state required local agencies to form regional consortia. These consortia were groups of educational agencies and other community organizations that worked together to plan and deliver adult education services in their region. Each consortium had to conduct a regional needs assessment, identifying the most pressing educational needs in their area, and then coming up with a plan for how to meet those needs with the funding provided. The formation of consortia was intended to improve coordination and ensure that funding was used in the most effective way possible, making sure that adult learners had access to a broad range of services and opportunities. After the AEBG was implemented, the state continued to increase funding for adult education. In 2016, the state added another $60 million to the AEBG allocation, bringing the funding total to $560 million annually. CAEP was established as part of this effort to streamline and enhance adult education services. The program continued to fund adult schools, community colleges, and other agencies working to provide high-quality education for adults, with a particular focus on helping them acquire skills for employment, transition to higher education, and improve overall quality of life. A key part of the CAEP funding was to support workforce development initiatives, including career training, job readiness programs, and workforce alignment to ensure that adult learners could meet the needs of the labor market. In 2018, California continued to make investments in adult education by adding additional funding for specific programs such as basic skills development, English language acquisition, and high school diploma programs. The state also put more emphasis on ensuring that programs were accessible to marginalized communities, including immigrants, low-income families, and those with disabilities. The aim was to reduce barriers to adult education and make sure the programs were available to everyone who needed them. By 2020, CAEP funding had been integrated into the larger discussion around workforce development, equity, and social mobility in California. Adult education was seen as a key strategy to help adults adapt to a rapidly changing economy, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. The state also began to focus more on measuring the outcomes of adult education programs. There was a stronger push to track how well programs were preparing students for the workforce, college, or other pathways. In response to the pandemic, adult education programs had to quickly adapt to online learning and other virtual education models, which presented new challenges but also opportunities for expanding access to learning. Today, CAEP funding continues to support adult education across California with a budget of around $800 million annually, though the amount can vary slightly each year based on state budgets and priorities. The focus is still on providing adult learners with the skills they need to succeed in the workforce, whether through basic literacy, job training, high school diplomas, or ESL programs. As high school enrollment declines throughout the state, adult education is receiving more focus and investment as a way to mitigate the loss of enrollments. More emphasis is also being placed on data-driven outcomes, meaning that the state wants to ensure that funding leads to tangible results like higher graduation rates, job placement, and career advancement for adult learners. Presently, adult education in California is working to increase our focus on equity and make sure that our funding makes programs available to all community members. We're working to align our programs with the workforce needs, and we are working to increase enrollment to mitigate the declining K-12 enrollments statewide. In the future, California adult education will continue along these lines. There is an increased focus on holistic support for students, offering comprehensive services to ensure that adult learners can succeed. To expand the use of digital tools and flexible learning options. To align education with growing industries and an ever-changing job market, and to support the lifelong learning and continuous skill building that adults will need throughout their careers. We thank you for your time learning about the California Adult Education Program today.